The winter came and went. Leslie Allison was born a month after Laura's first birthday, and the family was finally reunited in our little apartment in Heidelberg. And was I ever married, the full weight of it didn't strike me until the day after Leslie's birth, when I met Del Evans, who'd been assigned to an armoured cav regiment near Nuremberg, and his family at the Frankfurt airport. I couldn't help but remember the first time I'd met Dee outside of Korea at his little house at Benning 8 years before then. The freewheeling bachelor had, and understood how he could handle the adventurous married family life. Now, as I took the whole Evans crew to our home for their first night in country, it suddenly occurred to me that I still couldn't understand it, but that I damned well better figure it out, because with a wife and 2 kids I sure was there too. On the other hand, maybe an adventure was not as far off as I thought. I passed my annual physical, including the hearing test, with flying colours, and with Colonel Quigg greasing the skids, immediately transferred out of missiles and back to the infantry Quigg, who was a great friend of Colonel Maxis, also set in motion my request to go to an infantry unit, and suggested that I apply for regular army. No way, I told him the last time I'd taken that suggestion I'd almost been shot at dawn. Besides, I didn't care if I were RA or career reservist. In fact, in some ways being a career reservist was better. The DCSPR managers more or less regarded us reserve types as Christmas help, so with no tickets to punch, we were virtually assured of having repeated troop duty assignments as well. It seemed that my infantry friends who'd gone RA had had to branch transfer to armour. In the process, the army had switched off to some degree, at least push-button war, and was now grooming its regular army studs like Del Evans and Phil Gilchrist for command of tank units to be employed in a conventional ground war against Russia in Europe. I'd done my tank duty, and I knew it was not for me. All I wanted was just what I got the chance to wear those crossed rifles again. Now I just needed a crackerjack unit to wear them in on 20th of January 1961. 43-year-old John F. Kennedy was inaugurated as the 35th President of the United States. We were in Berusgoden skiing that day, and I rushed back to the hotel to hear his inaugural address. It was like being a kid again, crowding around the radio with Graham, Uncle Frank Roy, and our sister Mary, who come to live with us after a few years of being shunted around among our relatives in Colorado to listen to FDR during the grim war years. "Let the word go forth," the new president said from this time and place, "to friend and foe alike, that the torch has been passed to a new generation of Americans. Let every nation know, whether it wishes us well or ill, that we shall pay any price, bear any burden, meet any hardship, support any friend, oppose any foe, to assure the survival and the success of liberty. This much we pledge, and more." President Kennedy filled us all with such hope. His words gave the nation a sense of purpose, and I was never prouder of being an American or of wearing the uniform than I was at that time, and I was not alone. Servicemen all over Europe were standing with heads held just that much higher. Germans greeted us on the streets and saluted. It was as if Kennedy were their new leader too. JFK brought about a relationship between nationals and occupiers. Unlike I'd seen since Italy in 1946, we'd been viewed as saviours. Then it was only with the passage of time that our familiar faces began to breed contempt among the citizens of that land. How long the Kennedy magic would last, none of us could guess. But for the moment he was the shot in the arm America, the US military, and the free world desperately needed. The last months of the Eisenhower administration had been pretty bleak. On the 1st of May 1960, Gary Powers had been shot down over Soviet airspace in his high-flying spying U-2, although such reconnaissance flights had been going on for 4 years or so, Defense Secretary Thomas Gates admitted. Some months later, this one just weeks before the East-West summit in Paris, dampened any hopes for progress in relations between the two major powers. The whole affair was made all the worse by America's first denying any knowledge of a spy mission, then coming up with excuses for Powers straying into the Soviet sphere, and finally having to admit the truth when Powers began to tell all it had been horribly mortifying for the administration to be caught red-handed, and even worse was the absolute glee with which Koch announced his catch. Finally in Paris, the West's worst fears had been confirmed. When Khrushchev walked out of the summit conference in fury, the Cold War was heating up on the home front. the ongoing fight between Ike and the three-servant had raged on, while inter-service rivalry reached a fevered pitch of its own. Maxwell D. Taylor, The Uncertain Trumpet, had been published, beseeching the administration to abandon massive retaliation as a strategy and replace it with one of flexible response. Eisenhower, still determined to balance the budget for fiscal year 1961 in the twilight days of his presidency, made everyone mad by deciding to hold defense spending exactly where it was. In the meantime, in order to halt the flow of gold going out of the country, Ike decided to cut American spending overseas by ordering dependents of servicemen based abroad to come home. The order was almost inconceivable from the guy who used to wear 5 stars in terms of Eisenhower's track record, though it was just another morale buster for a hell of a lot of soldiers. And then there had been the emergence of a military-industrial complex, which Ike pinpointed in his farewell address 3 days before Kennedy's inauguration in the Councils of Government. We must guard against the acquisition of unwarranted influence sought or unsought by the military-industrial complex. The potential for the disastrous rise of misplaced power exists and will persist, Eisenhower had warned. And in the last years of his administration, claims had come fast and furious that abuses were already occurring. Ex-military officials were being snapped up as chairman executives, and/or key employees of the defense contractors as fast as they retired, and it was claimed that many used the old buddy net to get their new bosses a piece of the action on the ground. None of us really cared much of. Greater interest was what Kennedy, the new president, would do to dismantle Ike's new look. One of the first things he did almost the minute he took office was resend the all-dependents home decree. Most of us just waited with bated breath for what would come next. What did come next was one of the biggest bloopers of all time. It was committed by the new Secretary of Defense whiz-kid Robert McNamara, who told newsmen there was no missile gap between America and the Soviet Union, given that this gap was an essential plank in Kennedy's election campaign. Both the press and the Republicans had a field day until the position was clarified through typically political semantics. A missile gap did indeed exist, but according to the newly battle-tried Secretary of Defense. There was no destruction gap, at least at the moment, to assure that this ladder gap did not become a reality. JFK raised Ike's FY61 defense budget by $2 billion, one half of it, devoted to missiles launchers and blast-resistant underground silos for our Atlas and Titan ICBMs, at the same time to the relief of the few die-hard remnants of the old Army. Renewed emphasis was placed on conventional war capabilities, with an initial 5,000-man increase in the Army's ground forces, and 3,000 more Marines and non-nuclear weapons to cope with brushfire wars, for which nuclear retaliation would be somewhat of an overreaction. I thought it was quite funny how similar ex-military men Ike and ex-Ford Motor Company President McCamara were in terms of stroke-of-the-pen defense spending decisions, yet with such different results with one slash, for example. McCamara had Kennedy a nuclear-powered airplane program on which the Eisenhower administration had. Lavished $1 billion at 44 McNamara was AAR cry from Ike's first Secretary of Defense, Charles Wilson, of whom a Chief of Staff once said he was the most uninformed man and the most determined to remain. So that has ever been Secretary. McNamara wanted to know everything, and if the generals had anything to about at all, it was that McNamara wanted his information yesterday, not next week or next month, and was less concerned about each service's pet projects than he was about developing a worthwhile, cost-effective defense program. So with MAM's no-nonsense corporate approach to America's defense and JFK's apparent vision, it seemed in those earliest days that maybe the Army and the nation were about to get back on track. But then came a debacle of the First Order One the fledgling Kennedy administration inherited from Ike time, was showing that my idol, Castro the nationalist patriot, had never been much of a Democrat, though the Eisenhower administration's fear of a Soviet satellite in our backyard had yet to come to pass. Castro's communistic leanings were growing more apparent by the day. From the start, the US position hadn't helped the situation much. As if to show Castro who's boss, the US moved to deny Cuba access to American sugar markets. In turn, Castro sought and received economic assistance from the Soviet Union. Meanwhile, a not insignificant portion of middle-class Cubans were less than happy with the new regime, and by the time Kennedy was elected, the overeager CIA believed that given the means Castro could be overthrown, the people are ready. They told the president, they'll rise up and meet us on the beach. We can liberate them. What followed was the Bay of Pigs. The faultiness of the intelligence for this operation could not be overstated. The US-based Cuban exiles who stormed the beach were not met by cheering crowds, but by a well-armed Cuban army. This disastrous attempt at a counter-coup resulted in 87 wounded among the invasion force, 250 dead and long columns of PS, most of whom were returned in an extortion-like exchange for farming equipment and medical supplies. It caused the new administration extreme embarrassment and sent Castro scooting firmly into the Soviet camp. I don't know which disappointed me more, Kennedy's bad judgment or Castro's losing his white once and for all. Now old Fidel was just the enemy. Now he was just a goddamn red. The beautiful Heiberg Spring gave way to summer Patty, and I took the kids on picnics and bicky rides through the vineyards and the manicured Black Forest by the castles and the Nessa River. I really enjoyed being a husband and father at times like these, but with no childhood role model for either, it was pretty much a touch-and-go situation. I could only handle each in small doses. Like most American servicemen and families overseas, we didn't socialize with the RADs short for comrades, our name for the German people, and everyone seemed to like it better that way. We lived in the Mark Twain American military village, we listened to American radio, saw American films, drank American booze at the American officers' clubs, and shopped at the American PX for American goodies. All in all, a tour in Germany was not that much different from a tour at Fort Benning, except that things were cheaper overseas, and the Germans were so damned efficient. Our only close German contact was the housekeeper I had employed while Patty was in the hospital. She was a skinny old lady who looked more like an ostrich than a human being. She had a mind of her own, and from the moment Patty got home it was all out. War, the final battleground, was the kitchen floor, which Frau Gobler was cleaning with the sponge ordinarily used to wash dishes. It had happened before, and Patty, with her sterile surgical nursing background, couldn't bear it. She hit the roof, and the housekeeping arrangement was terminated on the spot. Some time later I was summoned to a German magistrate court to explain why Frau Gobler was released without notice when I related the sponge incident. The courtroom audience broke up laughing. I squirmed with embarrassment in. The dueling scar or so went the story from his pre-war postgraduate training at the Munich Technicia Hula that crossed one of them, in no way detracted from his rugged yet gentle old soldier face. Maybe the scar even enhanced it, I don't know, but it sure gave it more character and provided a good yarn to boot in any event. Colonel Glover S. Johns was a 49-year-old stud. He wanted me to be his assistant. S3, I wanted a rifle company. He said I'd already had far more than my share of command experience as far as the career-balancing Pentagon paper shufflers were concerned. I said I'd been out of infantry since 1953, and the only way to get caught up on the ins and outs of the changing pentomic setup would be to learn it down with the troops. Besides, I knew I'd soon be promoted to major, and this would be my last shot at command at the company level after that, with virtually no command billets for majors. I'd go to staff, and with promotions so slow, unless there was a war somewhere, could expect to retire in 5 years at that rank without commanding another trooper at all. JNS gave me a long look, then with laughing eyes he said, "Well, son, I can only give you the best I've got," and went on to tell me about Company D, with under the command of Captain Donald Hanson, had just passed its company army training test with max scores, and was well reputed as the finest unit in the battle group. Oh boy, I thought it's a pain to take over the best. If you take the worst, anything you do is considered great, but with the best, even the most spectacular accomplishments are treated as everyday occurrences, if they're treated at all. On top of that, it's damned hard to make a mark on a unit already full of hotshots. Johns knew all this, of course, or as he would have put it, natch for. Naturally, it was as though he'd thrown down a gauntlet, and it was my choice whether or not to accept the challenge, but natch he knew would before I left the office. JNS told me one last 40th Division war story about his first night with the Fireball. I was in a battalion HQ on the line. He said at about Z300 the whole staff went nuts. I thought maybe I'd rouse myself a little to see what was happening. Turns out, they just had word a patrol was fired on someone said, "God, we better get this to corpse immediately," while the rest of them were running around like headless chickens. Now Captain J&S continued in his slow drawl, "I would have reduced any company commander of mine to a bloody pulp if he'd called me at 0300 had I been asleep," which I usually was not to say one of his patrols had run into a problem. All I'd want to know was who caused it and what they did about it, and I wouldn't want to know that until I could get it in detail after the patrol got back. Unless, of course, he added they'd run into something serious in the way of an enemy move. But you see, he said, becoming a teacher, as if I were one of the fortunate cadets who had studied at Virginia Military Institute VMI while he was commandant there, his most recent assignment before the 18th. The army took a hell of a beating in Korea, and the greatest part was after the heavy fighting was over. First, there was the no-win war spirit, then there were the political limitations imposed on US during the peace negotiations, and the army meekly submitted, raising higher and ever higher the point of responsibility for the smallest action. I was a regimental commander, and if I couldn't send out even one patrol without corps approval of the plan submitted 48 hours in advance, what did that make all you company and battalion CEOs messenger boys? You had no authority, you had no room to run, no room to fail. I believe a young officer should have room to fail, Captain Hackworth. He said, "I knew I was home. Let's get something straight from the start, Captain. What's that top? You're the skipper. You command this outfit." "But I run it, don't you forget I run it," so counselled my first sergeant, Master Sergeant James J. Sweeney. As if by way of introduction I could have hugged him. Sweeney's record spoke for itself, 4 combat jumps with Jim Gavin's 505th Parachute Regiment. In the 82nd Airborne Attendant fighting with distinction across Europe, and then in Korea 6 years later. Now this leathery old soldier of 20-some years' experience who still carried all his worldly goods in 2 duffel bags stood straight as a West Point plea before me, his deep-set eyes challenging and confident as he told me the lay of the land and D Company 118 INF, and I couldn't have agreed with him more. I'd found myself with a commander's dream. A great enthusiastic unit ramrodded by the best NCO corps I'd seen since Trieste. The NCOs were real professionals, from here to eternity types most with World War II, and Korean combat experience who knew what they were doing, did it well, and made my job a breeze in garrison. I seldom had to give an order if I looked at my watch and said, "Top, it's time to fall the company out." The first sergeant's response would be, "They're out in the company street, sir, like 4 rows of corn." If I said, "Sweeney, are we set for the alert?" his reply would be, "Yes, sir, the troops are leaning forward in their foxholes." It was about this time I finally concluded that the army, if it hadn't had the ongoing requirement of producing senior officers, wouldn't need good lieutenants or even good captains at the company level. As long as it had good sergeants, I'd probably sensed this all along. But it had taken me 16 full years to know it as a military truth in a company. One of the main things that was needed was continuity officers were moved from job to job. So frequently I'd seen it time and again in Korea that they could provide little of that. A wizened old sergeant could, among the other essentials, besides raw leadership, were hands-on knowledge and good common sense. In these regards, an experienced senior sergeant was usually far better qualified to lead than the average company-grade officer. No doubt I was a bit biased, but I found that by giving my non-coms the free rein ID had as far back as Trieste under Captain Eglin, they pulled like hell for me, and with Sweeney and his NCOs anticipating every drill, D Company ran like a well-greased machine. Most of the 18th NCOs had been with the unit for at least 6 years, 3 at Fort Riley, Kansas, before the LST division became pentomic, and its battle groups were gyroscoped to Germany for a 3-year tour. Bottom line, professionalism was probably the only thing that had kept these fine, dedicated men from outright rebellion during the big switch, when in Germany they found that in the interests of saving money, the 1st Division's manoeuvre units were to be reassigned to the 8th Div, while their own 1st DV colours stayed at Fort Riley, controlling the 8th Div units that had gyroscope home. It was the non-thinking Pentagon movers, in one of their more infamous hours, the proud regiments of the 1st Division, The 16th Rangers, the 18th Vanguards, and the 26th Blue Spears had been 1st Div Regiment since 197 when the division was formed. The unit had a glorious battle record, as well as the distinction of being the first to fight in both World Wars. The th, on the other hand, first saw combat in World War II, was inactivated after the war, and was reactivated 5 years later as a training division. In fairness, the th had fought well during the war, but that was not the point. The Big Red One patch allowed no one to forget that unit's place as America's premier division. To expect a long-time 1st Div man to exchange it for another was tantamount to asking him to join the wax talk about morale busters. As it was, most of the old NOCOs were just marking time until their overseas tour was up, and they could go back to Fort Riley and their beloved Big Red One still. While they were there, the NCOs gave the 8th D their all, and they were of particular assistance to me in my first weeks with D Company. The outfit I'd inherited was good, but not, or so said, then weapons platoon leader Lieutenant Brian Tim Grattan some months later, as good as its members. Thought right away I saw little areas here and there where I could make it even better, and set about making changes with great enthusiasm. Most, as was becoming my style, regarded training when I first arrived in the 118th. I was surprised to find that many mornings at Revet the troops had to recite like robots in unison at the top of their lungs, a little number called the Code of Conduct for members of the Armed Forces of the United States. I am an American fighting man. I serve in the forces which guard my country and our way of life. I am prepared to give my life in their defense. I will never surrender of my own free will if in command. I will never surrender my men while they still have the means to resist. If I am captured, I will continue to resist by all means available. I will make every effort to escape and aid others to escape. I will accept no special favors from the enemy if I become a prisoner of war. I will keep faith with my fellow prisoners. I will give no information or take part in any action which might be harmful to my comrades. If I am senior, I will take command. If not, I will obey the lawful orders of those appointed over me, and will back them up in every way when questioned should I become a prisoner of war. I am bound to give only name, rank, service number, and date of birth. I will evade answering further questions to the utmost of my ability. I will make no oral or written statements disloyal to my country and its allies, or harmful to their cause. I will never forget that I am an American fighting man, responsible for my actions and dedicated to the principles which made my country free. I will trust in my God and in the United States of America. The code had been developed by an all-knowing Pentagon study group in response to the appalling manner in which American PS conducted themselves during the Korean War, becoming turncoats denouncing America playing footsie with the Reds, etc. In all, 43% of men captured collaborated with the enemy. In some way, the purpose of the thing was to steal the will of soldiers in future wars, but it was closing the proverbial barn door after the horse had bolted. If we'd had hardened, well-trained and well-led soldiers in Korea, we wouldn't have had all those PS to begin with. The US Marine Corps had very few outfits, like the tough Ethiopians had none. To me, the code of conduct was a silly and degrading exercise, and it was potentially dangerous too, in that as an army-wide preventive wartime cure, all it could easily lead to even worse complacency in the peacetime training program. Now 6 years old, the code was a quick fix that addressed the symptoms, not the disease, but not in D Company, or for that matter in the whole 118th Infantry Battle Group for the first time since I'd said goodbye to the great White Father General Cleland. I was, in an organisation whose Commander Johns and Deputy Colonel George Couch, another great brown shoe army soldier, and a World War II Big Red One man, concurred totally with my unwavering belief that the more sweat on the training field, the less blood on the battlefield every morning in D Company, began with a long, hard run, the length depending on how much time I had up my sleeve and how mean I felt the platoon sergeants, platoon leaders, and I ran backwards, counting chewing ass and enaging and using up twice as much energy as the troops. With all the usual bitching that accompanied the runs, the boys got stronger, and as important felt stronger, I took them on long marches in full gear and reintroduced my CA policy of having every soldier's feet examined immediately afterward by his squad leader, platoon leader, and me all this nuclear battlefield crap notwithstanding. I still maintained that an infantry trooper's feet were the mobility of the nation the kids knew cared when I squatted down over their sweaty feet to make sure they were okay, and in the process I was able to instill my troop leading style into the young studs who would be commanding during the next war, as well as my great NCOs. I'd been blessed in the officer department too. Lieutenant Ferraro, Dave Adderley, Joe Woodridge, whose admiral father had been one of the planners for the Bay of Pigs, and Tim Grattan were all distinguished. Military graduates, DMGs, fresh out of University Rock, or the Military Academy, Adderley, Grattan, Ferraro, and my EXO AgVet had been football stars in their college days. SVIT was All-American and captain of the West Point team. All 5 men were in fine shape, as well as being well-motivated, sharp young regular officers. We'd had a somewhat rocky start. They all thought I was crazy. But after these boys were introduced to Willy Lump Lump, and I had them in their unit sit down in front of a movie projector and watch the World War II Italian campaign documentary The Battle of San Pietro, they began to understand what I was all about and why I was training them so hard. I'd shown the film in every unit I'd commanded to date. It was a brilliant picture that showed on the ground real-life infantry and combat. I loved it for a lot of reasons. The main one being it dispelled all myths of war as a cops and robbers game. I always felt they should have given salty old John Huston the Blue Max just for making it. I gave as many classes personally as I could, not only for the benefit of the troops but for myself. I found that the teacher learns as much as if not more than his students, and it also kept my own skills sharpened to a fine edge. It's easy to lose touch with the basics, and you become less inclined to get them back once you've moved up the ladder. I'd seen too many high-ranking officers who'd stopped trying, having decided I guessed that they were above all that Colonel JNS was not among this group. Though JNS was a basics man and a total soldier, he taught and insisted that his company commanders teach things like terrain appreciation, the knowledge of which was a basic tool of a soldier's trade, to be able to look at a piece of ground and appreciate the slightest differences in the contour, to notice how the ground unfolds and be able to think. There's cover over there, cover the one essential providing protection from direct enemy fire, to recognize a streamline, a gully or a treat area, as an avenue of approach through which a unit could move unseen to understand and identify the best ground from which to launch or repel an attack shoot. Scoot and communicate, the 3 R's of infantry, were where Johns began, and worked his way up. The morning battle drill began with fire and manoeuvre, one man firing, while his buddy moved a fire team moving, while its counterpart fired. Colonel Johns likened it to a fighter's bobbing, weaving and jabbing. We kept the mythical enemy pinned down while we jabbed our way to close on his position. The colonel was right there with us to set the example, and we did it just as we had with Prena in the NR, until we got it right. We'd end up black and blue. Running, hitting the ground and rolling into firing position with full field equipment on is not without pain, but no one bitched because Jays again and again reinforced the simple equation: the quicker you get to the ground and get your weapon into position, the sooner you'll be delivering effective fire on the enemy and the longer you'll stay alive. Still, this was just one part of the overall strive to better your best philosophy that characterized the 18th under Colonel Johns and Deputy Co-Couch. In Couch's words, it was our policy to encourage excellence among the soldiers, particularly in bayonet training, unarmed combat shooting, and total physical fitness. This is what really makes a soldier. If he masters these subjects, he'll fight. From my experience in Korea, I could not have agreed more. D Company trained hard, staying in the field at least 4 days a week. We never set up tents or any other administrative comforts. Instead, we'd form a defensive perimeter or pretend we were online tied into another unit. Everything was tactical steel pots on faces and uniforms camouflaged. No one bunched up rifles at the ready. Even chow call was done tactically. The mess truck covered with a camouflage net, guys well spaced out as they filed through their weapons at no time more than an arm's distance away. I stressed the basics all along. I'd have one platoon aggress against another. Little Bighorn Sitting Bull had tasked this tribe to go down a ravine and come up behind Custer's Easy Company. But they went down the wrong ravine, and as usual got lost. The chief of the tribe, realizing his error, went up to the top of the hill and called out mournfully, "Where the hell are we resonating throughout the hills?" His call sounded like Fugawi, and Sitting Bull said, "From now on they will be known as the Fugawi in the 18th. The Fugawi Award went to the company or individual staff officer responsible for the biggest snafu or screw-up of the week." Johns would give a kind of humbling but often hilarious recapitulation of how it had gone. In this neat way, lessons were learned and admonishments given, but no one was hurt because it was all good fun. And fun was a necessary component in an otherwise painfully boring peacetime scene, particularly for combat units like ours. The 8th Division acted as 7th Army Reserve. We were way back from where the main fighting lines would be, and because there were airborne battle groups in the division as well, we vanguards would be the last to be employed a year before the 18th had received the highest combat readiness rating in 7th Army. As a result, our role had become theoretically that of a general fire brigade, with all kinds of contingency plans and NATO responsibilities as well, only a stone's throw from Heidelberg-Jena, and that great General Bruce Clark. We had more than our share of visiting Rennes, which meant honour guards parades and jumping through flaming hoops on command. These created a lot of pressure, but on a nuts and bolts level, life in the 18th consisted mainly of training practice alerts and waiting for the east-west balloon to go up for real. Or if you were into that kind of thing, paperwork. The paperwork was enormous, with directives coming from DA 7th Army 5th Corps Division and Battle Group, all of which requiring answers reports and further implementing instructions. If a company commander chose, he could easily spend his time fighting this bureaucratic war and never see his troops at all. Swollen HQs, like the one I'd recently left, had nothing else to do as they scribbled away their boredom. They did not consider the impact of their work down at the manoeuvre level personally. I refused to get wrapped around the axle in red tape from higher HQ or in normal company administrative detail. I left it all to Big Edet, who was brilliant at this sort of thing, and stayed in the field instead, working to create some excitement and adventure for my troops while getting them prepared to fight a real war, knowing how important food was to them. I often broke regulations and snuck my mess truck forward, so a piping hot breakfast would be waiting when we got to the field. I had a great mess. Sergeant who converted the truck into a mobile diner. It reached the point where he cooked on the move, and the boys could file through and pick up steaming coffee and huge sandwiches of scrambled eggs and bacon on toast. It sure beat cold seas, which they ate on the way to the LD. Often I'd call the mess sergeant in the middle of the last day of an exercise and tell him I wanted to surprise the troops for their job well done. I'd give him our ETA and he'd be at the front gate to meet us, bearing a hamburger and a big bottle of German beer for every guy. No one had to pay. We always did this toward the end of the month when everyone was broke. Money came from our highly irregular, totally unauthorized slush fund. Monitored by you, we generated capital for the fund by renting out our mobile Me as a snack bar to other companies. When they were in the field, we also had an unauthorized company bar where the guys could go during off-duty hours in their fatigues for drinks, pretzels, and sandwiches. What was so good about all this, besides the obvious morale lift, was that it gave us the means to improve our overall life and times, throw an occasional party, and send guys off in style. No one had to go around asking people to chip in $1 to buy some guy a going-away present, instead through slush fund proceeds. I had little Company D being there, trophies made. It was just a small thing, this memento of our service together, but it did wonders for team spirit. Every few months, the 18th went up to Balholder, a former German training area north of Mannheim, and home to the ETHDIV live firing ranges and manoeuvre areas for a couple of weeks of field exercises. Balholder was a dreary, desolate place that seemed to have a corner on rain mud, and ragweed Tim Grattan was my partner in misery there during hay fever season. Both our allergies further aggravated by the dust kicked up on manoeuvres. Neither of us could open our eyes in the morning. It sometimes took half an hour to soak the dried pus off before we could even muster a blink. But the battle group manoeuvres were great. The old NCOs knew every fold in the ground by memory. They were like Indian scouts. They seldom used maps and referred to objectives as the hill where Captain Holland got lost or other event-tied coordinates. Colonel John's Gatch was magic in the field. General Grant of the Civil War was reputed to have had a somewhat simple captain, whom he vetted all his orders through figuring that if this guy understood everyone, would JNS employed a Grant's captain, as it had become known of his own, and as a result his operations orders were always clear, and to the point he also left the door wide open for questions. If for whatever reason a subordinate wasn't sure of his task, find out what the goddamn mission is, JNS would counsel before you go slapping off the walls. It was a most welcome invitation. The average company commander, especially in the new got-to perfect. Army was one afraid to admit. He wasn't sure he might perhaps ask one of his peers for clarification or advice, but heaven forbid he should go to the source and be branded a little slow on the draw or just plain dumb on his next ER. JNS didn't give a damn about ER. In fact, he was repulsed by what he saw them doing to the army in the field. He just wanted results, and knew the only way to get them was to make sure his people knew what they were doing and got it right the first time around. One night on manoeuvres, the battle group operations officer newly promoted Major Sapenter kept bugging me for my flag location. It was pitch black and pouring rain, and I didn't know where the hell we were, except that we were still not settled in when we're set up. I'll give you the coordinates. I told him the constant harassment on the field phone continued, according to battle group. Sap boomed through the wires. I should have had your report 30 minutes ago. You are violating battle group SOP captain. I really did hate staff officers, even good ones like old Sap, whom I'd known since Korea. I grabbed the phone out of the hands of Robbie Robinson, my wonderful RTO look major. I snapped, "If it'll make you happy, you just take the battle group SOP and shove it up your arse, because I'm not giving you a report on anything until I'm goddamn well ready." Next thing I knew, the phone sounded again, and through it came a slow Texas draw hack. "The C-Colal began Sap here. Just told me about this little problem you've got. I think you might be being a bit hard on him. What do you think? How about just stretching? A poncho over your head, flipping on a flashlight and giving us those coordinates so we can send them on to Division Colonel Johns. If you have a look at Clay Pigeons of St. Lowe, you'll see that the young battalion commander tells his regimental S3 exactly what I've just told your S3 seems to me. That's following the real battle group." "Sup?" John laughed. "It's mighty hard to argue with that, son. You've got your SOPs right. Get back to us when you can, when we came in from the field. JNS," and I laughed about it again, even though he cautioned me to think twice before blowing my top. He added that from his experience he'd concluded that in combat a CO will put up with just about any insubordination, as long as the subordinate wins the fight. It made sense to me, but it wasn't for a few years yet that I'd know exactly what he meant. If Colonel Johns was an old soldier, our battle group chaplain, Father Francis Xavier O'Connor, was an old soldier's padre. This huge XF Foot B player Irishman drove around the battle group to give absolution and say mass in an unauthorized jeep borrowed from the Calave, with a machine gun mounted on the back. He could also drink and curse with the best of us. Still, only once did I witness even a temporary slip from grace, and that was one night at the Bomb Holder Officer Club. Father O.K. Connor played the piano and regularly led the battle group officers in rowdy sing-alongs. I just want to play piano in at Bomb Holder. We were right in the middle of one such off-colour little tune when the assistant division commander bustled in, chewed every one of our asses, including the chaplain, and banned us from the club for singing unbecoming an officer. "There are ladies in the club," he raged. We moved out our heads hung low, but not before giving winks to the ladies who had in fact been humming, if not singing along as well. But how did the other ladies, the wives Farrar throughout the days on end, when their husbands were in the field as well as possible? But all things considered, theirs was a pretty empty lot. 2 dreams of romantic reunions. Upon our return were regularly shattered, so close yet so far away, well-described life for the Company D officers' wives in Mannheim, while we were home at Coleman Barracks, and the wives collectively, unfairly, I thought, hated me for it. Sure, it was my fault the carpool to work left at 500, and it probably was my fault that we didn't knock off until around 7 in the evening, but could I be blamed for the fact that by the time we'd finished drinking a few beers and shooting the breeze at was 10? At night, before he honey, what's for dinner rang out through most D Company apartments in Benjamin Franklin Village, we men just never stopped. Each evening, we'd discuss the day's events, then we'd talk about what we were going to do the next day, and the next week, Sunday, the one full day off, was spent sleeping and gearing up to start all over again. I might have started the ball rolling, but now it was total gung-ho dedication on all our parts to make D Company the best rifle company in the world, having such. A tight group of officers did wonders for the morale of the whole outfit, but it took a hell of a toll on the home front. None of us consciously decided to lock the girls out, but there was a certain perverse pleasure in speaking in the silent shorthand we developed over many a beer. Dozens of signals, like the hand over the mouth palm up, meant, say, "No more, you've said enough." A forefinger pulling down at the bottom eyelid meant I indeed know better. A forefinger on the nose meant surely this guy is bullshitting, sir, while our wives, oblivious, chatted away by our sides, so they shouldn't have married military men. It's a terrible life that never gets better. The job has top priority. The wife and family get what's left. The wife has to be a perfect woman to match up with and help. Advance her ambitious, perfect husband. She has to put up with loneliness. She has to be prepared to move at a moment's notice, and at the same time have the old quarters, which were always too small for active little kids, and by no means child-proof, unscratched, uncuffed, and so clean that even the most tyrannical housing inspector with the keenest eyes and whitest gloves in the world could not level a statement of charges, hold up the move and put the word out that she, and by extension her husband, was a slob, and should she manage to get away with max scores for housekeeping, keeping all it meant was starting the same thing all over again, in another billet, identical to the last. The villages looked like serial German-made Holiday Inn's quarters, were close 8 families per single 4-storied stairwell, and on rainy days there'd be scores of toddlers racing up and down the steps. It was a wonder. None of the mothers jumped off their roofs. Worst off were the newlyweds. Lieutenants brought home $220 a month, and with all spare change going to buy cribs and strollers for a kid almost invariably conceived on the honeymoon. By the end of the month, husband and wife were eating cornflakes and powdered milk, and if by chance they weren't, or were driving a Chevy Wagewise, a captain's car and not a VW, the gossip would begin. Everyone knew what everyone else made, and if a family lived beyond its means, well, someone must have a rich daddy. But the wives made do, scurrying back and forth between apartments, borrowing sugar, playing bridge, and solving one another's problems. Many got involved doing charity work. Others hit the bottle or played around with words, somehow always getting back to the cuckolded husband. I personally was my normal rotten self, having neither time nor patience to understand my family's needs. When Patty knocked out 2 of her teeth in a bicycling mishap, she rang me at work. My response was, "What the hell do you expect me to do, for Christ's sake? Go to the dentist and don't ever call me at work again." XO Ed S's wife Pam was not really like the others. She was an ex-Aney stewardess and a liberated woman. Long before it was fashionable, every Wednesday afternoon, Ed had to go home and wax their apartment floors, or so went the word we all gave him a hard time about. What was a West Point Airborne Ranger All-American football player, U.S. Army stud, doing waxing the floor, while his wife stood nearby with her arms folded across her chest, or so we imagined. Unfortunately, I had to give up my personal raising. Ed was my neighbour at Benjamin Franklin Village, and our wives became good friends. Pam corrupted Patty into believing that she didn't have to shine my shoes or my brass a job I'd assigned her at the outset of our marriage, and that I could damn well do it myself. One evening I arrived home only to have the Riot Act read out, and Patty steadfastly refused to do this whaley chore ever again. How much nicer it would have been had she followed Colonel Johns's suggestion, offered up to the wives at one of their regular luncheons. When your man comes home from the field, you should be at the door to meet him. Martinis in one hand, your panties in the other. Unfortunately, it was a suggestion ably countered by Tim Grattan's wife Darlene, who said Colonel J&S forgot one thing: by the time you guys get home, you're too soused to even know the difference. Among the top EM in the unit was my driver RTO William Robbie Robinson. Robbie was bold and fast behind the wheel of our brand-new state-of-the-art M151 Jeep, which was actually a death trap with individual wheel suspension and a tendency to flip over. I called him Sterling when he was driving after race car driver Sterling Moss, and spent most of my time on the road hanging on tight and sucking up the seat in the field. Though in his guise at RTO, Robbie was diligent, careful, and almost sponge-like in the way he soaked up the skills necessary to command and fight a unit. In this respect, he reminded me a lot of Don Neri, my RTO in the Raiders, who as a corporal was actually given command after Hill 400, when all the leaders were evacuated until Lieutenant Arvidsson was found to take my place. No one had bitched, not even the more senior non-coms left in the unit. Everyone knew that Neri, because he'd been with me all the time, had the best know-how to keep the unit going strong. The relationship between commander and RTO is a unique one in the held or in combat. A CO goes nowhere without his radio. As a result, he and his RTO are together 24 hours a day. It's a very tight relationship over time. An RTO knows his CO as a woman knows her man. This puts the RTO in a uniquely powerful position. He lives with the troops, and because he's usually the first guy to determine what you're all about, i.e. if you care for your people, or if you're a phony, he can with a few words make or break you in his buddy's eyes at the same time. Because the RTO is in with the man, he often becomes the sounding board for the rest of the M's who figure he can get through where they can't. I always try to develop my relationship with my RTO on the order of, look man, if something bad's happening, I want to know if the troops are unhappy, you've got to tell me, I don't want names. I don't want you to be a squealer, but things ain't going to improve if I don't know what's wrong. Arto Robinson was just terrific. Eager to learn and fun to be with. Even when conditions themselves were far from pleasant, one bitterly cold night on manoeuvres, the battle group was fighting a withdrawal exercise through mountainous terrain. Company was located on the Koppel. Our mission was to delay, deceive, disorganize and deny the mythical enemy attack with my units to fall back on my order, and not before at present everything was going smoothly. So Robbie and I were just sitting under a poncho on the hood of our jeep, the motor running to keep us warm. I was exhausted during manoeuvres. You often went days without sleep. It was usually worse than combat, and now I found myself nodding off again and again. Finally, I told Robbie I had to catch a few winks, wake me if anything happens. I said sometime later. He shook me out of a sound sleep. Come on, Captain, we're moving. What do you mean we're moving? I haven't ordered the CPL in, sir. I did it an hour ago. You what, sir? I do. You realize it takes a corps commander, a General Robbie, to call in the Kopil. How it worked was if I felt the unit was under serious pressure, like about to be overrun. I'd call the battle group commander, give him a sitter, and recommend the Cops withdrawal. He in turn would call the division Co. Then that guy would call the Corps CG, who'd decide from the big picture whether it was time to pull in his protective screen. I know, sir. We were under a lot of pressure on the left flank. I notified S3. I've seen you do it 100 times, and you were so tired, I thought I'd go on and organize it for you. Now let's go. No one's indispensable, I thought, as we drove off in the jeep. Though in the final analysis, Robbie had only been the replacement messenger boy, as Johns had put it to me on my first day. With the 18th in the old days, a company commander had full authority to bring in his outposts. Now, in the modern post-Korea centralized army, the fate of my 200-odd men rested in the hands of a lieutenant general 100 miles away, but who would know better the company co on the ground, who sees the enemy charging up the hill and knows it's time to haul ass or have his units smashed and cut off, or a Corps CG who was so far up the chain of command he lives in a constant state of vertigo now and then while waiting for permission to give an order to my troops. I contemplated whether I should try to radio my Aunt Frida in Colorado. She was no more removed from the situation we were encountering than the Corps CG was, really. And besides, it might bring some excitement to her life. A systematic robbing of authority and prestige Colonel Johns was later to write to me describing deezing the lot of company commanders and NCOs during this period. Indeed, since the end of the Second World War, reports emanating from the post-WW War Dittel Commission, calling in part for mammoth reforms in the selection and training of officers and in the relationships between officers and enlisted men, were largely ignored with the introduction of computers in the 50s. The caste system, do it pinpointed, became even more deeply etched in stone, even among the NCOs. With the race for coveted supergrade E8 and E9 promotions becoming ticket-punching exercise in itself, then there was the Uniform Code of Military Justice UCMJ adopted in 1951, which robbed a company commander of the authority to administer punishment on his own, and certainly tied the fists of an old Army NCO. Since the UCMJ's inception, the use and abuse of the court-martial had become widespread personally. I sat on few court-martials. I had more important things to do with my time, like training my troops, and little by little, usually over a couple of beers, let the word go forth throughout the battle group that I thought any man up for a court-martial was guilty, and that any evidence produced on his behalf in an upcoming trial would not change my predetermined conclusion. This attitude generally led to my being challenged, so I didn't have to sit on the court-martial board at all, but few could completely escape the web of frustrated overreaction. Even Colonel Johns found himself tangled in it, when one of the company commanders court-martialed a staff sergeant for being 30 minutes late for revet. Hence AWOL, this was the kind of thing that in Trieste would be dealt with by the guy's platoon sergeant, who'd say, "Do you want to work for me or the captain?" And 9 times out of 10 the transgressor would opt for NCO justice. That might mean a whole bunch of knights making little rocks out of big rocks with an 18-pound sledgehammer, but it also meant no bad marks on the guy's record. In this case it was the sergeant's second offence, and the court-martial verdict that came down was bust. Him, Colonel JNS, who had made a rule about second offences, had no choice but to uphold the finding. The E5, as a result of the bust, could not keep his wife and children on in Germany. JNS told me later it was the hardest thing he ever did in his life, and felt it never would have happened had authority not been wrenched so completely from the hands of officers at the company level. The particular irony of this was found on the potential battlefield, while Company Kossos could not take a piss without consulting higher HQ for the time, place and manner in which to do it in the field. They were responsible for a staggeringly large defensive area. Our war positions in the event of a Soviet attack into West Germany were top secret. So secret that the maps were classified and locked away, we conducted recons without them in civilian clothes under the guise of picnickers. It was ridiculous really. 4 or 5 white-walled American men in a field having a picnic with binoculars and absolute military correctness, then strolling as aimlessly as possible, given our ingrained military sense of urgency through farms and villages, selecting fields of fire and defensive fallback positions when Tim Grattan showed me the battle group's war position at the F of Gap. I couldn't believe my eyes. My company front was 3 miles long in Korea, or World War II terms, regimental-sized, meaning 9 times bigger than any company front I'd ever held. The rationale behind it was obviously nuclear. In the Pentomic master plan, the enemy would be driven into killing zones such as the Fig Gap, at which point they would be creamed with tactical atomic weapons. Tactically, it was, in a word, crazy for European terrain. And for anything less than a decision to begin total war, the army had backed itself into a damned if you don't corner with those on the ground, the ones who'd pay the price, regardless of the chosen course of action, if TAC nukes were employed. And general war followed. The risk was there for massive destruction of foe and friend alike, throughout all of Europe, if not on a global scale, if the US powers that be decided not to use tactical atomic weapons at all. Our pentomic configuration, confronted by a conventional full-strength Soviet ground force, would only lead to the wholesale slaughter of friendly troops along the frighteningly thin battle line. The strategy was so weak it should have been disposed of hot off the drawing boards, along with the stupid and industrious staff officer at managers who'd cooked it up, everyone at the top, and it filtered down damn quick to the junior officer level was too busy doing to do any thinking, any real appraising or re-evaluating. On one of our secret recons, we bumped into 4 young West German officers. They were not examining future war positions. They were not even on duty. What they were 4 totally professional soldiers on leave, spending their time going over the ground of previous battles. Studying being reflective, theirs was a serious interest in the business of soldiering, and one seen all too infrequently in the US Army of the day. This was especially so in infantry, where being labelled introspective or studious was close to the kiss of death, those words having become almost synonymous with distracted, lazy, or antisocial. Instead we had hell. Will you look at that? Lieutenant Wonderboy, isn't he moving boy, isn't he aggressive? What a can-do guy, with the admirers themselves moving and grooving at breakneck speed, unable to stop long enough to notice that Lieutenant Wonderboy was actually like a dog chasing its own tail and never getting anywhere at all. The pentomic structure lent itself particularly well to fostering a can-do-don't think. Officer mentality, though the 18th under Colonel Johns was an exception to the rule, the battle group concept ignored basic known principles of command and control and dug a huge chasm between the battle group Co. and his individual company commanders in the old organization. 3 rifle companies which made up the battalion were commanded by a lieutenant colonel. 3 battalions which made up the old regiment were commanded by a birdful colonel, with the pentomic concept's destruction of the regiment and the fattening up of the battalion, as it were, to become a 5-rifle company battle-attle group. A decision was reached to make the new battle group unit a full colonel's billet. The immediate result of this was a frantic scramble among thousands of infantry birds for about 80 battle group command slots, an essential step. On the stairway. To those stars, and an enormous gap in both age and experience between battle group and company COSOS, the longer-term result was that not only infantry majors, but now lieutenant colonels too, went without a command assignment, and though it was ideal for them in terms of time to run after their tails chasing degrees to staff assignments and other essential punches on the old ticket, it meant that in the event of war within the decade, the army would find itself with a generation of middle-level commanders who had little, if any, command experience beyond the company level. If this alone were not caused to make a student of the military a bit uncomfortable. There was the problem of span of control, generally speaking. The known effective span of control for a CO is 5 subordinate maneuver elements in the old organization. This worked just fine. A battalion Co. would have 3 rifle companies, a weapons company, and maybe a tank unit as well. But in the battle group, a COO reached his optimum number with his rifle companies alone. Beyond these, he was responsible for the employment of the newly configured Battle Group Combat Support Company, which included mortar reconnaissance and radar platoon, and in the field additional attachments such as an engineer company, a couple of tank companies, and an artillery battalion. So on the pentomic battlefield, a CO could easily find himself with at least 9 maneuver elements well beyond the effective span of control for most colonels of the day. Of course, some SEOs, the ones who were calm, proficient at their trade, and well versed in the EB and flow of battle, could handle that number, and more, but they were the exceptions, not the rule, and I completely shared Colonel John's wish that the battle group concept die a quick and quiet death. The system had been devised by Chief of Staff Maxwell D. Taylor, and many of his first airborne protégés like others who held top spots in the army. A lot of these men had made their names in a few months' combat in World War II, and through quick wartime promotions found themselves as battalion commanders at the age of 23. They'd barely had time to experience life at the levels of platoon and company, and now they were the decision-makers making authoritative, grandiose policies that on the ground meant life or death to the small units they were essentially ignorant of. Nevertheless, we dutifully looked over the war positions assigned to us, kept silent. The thought that attempting to defend them against a Russian attack would be about as futile as trying to put out a forest fire with gasoline, and once or twice a month had our enthusiasm and readiness put to the test through practice alerts. The alert would come at 3 o'clock or 4. In the morning, while the troop ERS and on-base NCOs jumped out of their sacks, a couple of off-post personnel would be informed by roster. Each of these men would call 2 more people who'd call 2 more, and so on until everyone had gotten the word to get his ass to his unit. By that point, the on-post NCOs would be readying the troops, and trucks would have arrived to provide lift for our rations, petrol, water, and ammo, all of which far outstripped the capacity of our organic vehicles. All equipment was kept in a state of readiness for these alerts. You never knew, with all the contingencies we had going, if it would be the real thing. Within 2 hours we'd be at our war assembly areas. And while higher HQ inspectors clocked us in a screwed-up practice alert could mean the end of a CO's career, and ran around checking to see that we were all there and had left nothing behind in our rear area, I'd make sure my boys got maximum training value out of the exercise by having them set up defensively, get camouflage on, and make out. Our range cards, Company D, was almost always fessed with the mostest at the assembly area, but I could take little credit for our consistently fine performance. My top-notch NCOs ran the show. All I did was walk around during the outload, making my presence known. An organisation does well, only those things the boss checks. Bruce Clark always said the first time I'd heard the adage was when the general had it printed on thousands of 7x5 index cards to distribute around the command. I'd gotten mine in Enberg and loved it so much it had it framed with the thought of hanging it in every office I had for the rest of my career. It was a simple and straightforward command philosophy I'd adopted for my own, and no one could say they weren't warned when out of the blue I'd arrive for a quick look, see and tear asses if things weren't up to par like the night out in the field. When I caught 100% of one of my platoon sound asleep, no security on the line, no one even on the radio in the platoon CP. When I stomped in there, I roughly shook the platoon leader awake and started chewing his arse, royally. He scrambled out of his sleeping bag, and suddenly I forgot why I was so mad at him. I was struck dumb. This lieutenant in the field in a fart sack was wearing silk pyjamas, suffice to say it was an ass-chewing never to be forgotten. One of the most gung-ho of all the 18th Regular officers was Lieutenant Tom Johnson of CA Company. He was a fine stud, and so enthusiastic that we called him Ranger Tom one afternoon during a daylight training problem. Ranger Tom saw a uniformed Soviet officer in the distance observing Tom's platoon through field glasses. Johnson immediately went to ground, and with the finesse of my best raiders snuck up behind the guy, tackled him, and took him into custody. Only then did he find out that the comrade was authorized belonging to a military observer group based in Potsdam, which allowed the Soviets and the Americans to inspect and monitor each other's training and troop deployment, meant all of us had a good laugh over the incident. But with Kusov crowing about Russia's superiority in both nuclear and conventional war-making, it was little wonder that guys on the ground got a little jumpy, and for myself I'd learned the hard way that it was pretty tough to trust anyone. After all these months I'd received word that I would soon have to appear as a witness against Harold Borgia, who'd been arrested while buying secret documents at the Urgi railroad station. It was a strange period of conflicting signals, not only between East and West, but within the US Army as well. Know your communist enemy dominated. With mattresses, but you only had to jump out of an airplane once to know that no mattress is going to save you. If you come down and land smack up against the turret of a tank, the terrible conditions on the ground were matched only by the lousy weather, and the drop was delayed most of the day. My great buddy Dick Coker, a fine young captain who was COO of B Company, joined me in the long wait at a local gas house. It was late afternoon before we heard the buzz of approaching aircraft indicating the drop was inbound. We hauled ass out to the DZ just in time to see one of the first guys come down a West Point lieutenant who did everything right, except that he smashed right into a tree and broke both his legs. Soon Dick and I joined our respective assigned companies. The manoeuvre continued for a few hours, when suddenly a large army helicopter flew over the scene. Attention, attention, we heard booming down from the PA system on the hovering craft. All personnel from the 18th Infantry report to this chopper in the bird. We were told the battle group was moving out for some big emergency, but what it was no one knew. Colonel C, who'd also come up for Operation Windrift as its chief umpire, was equally in the dark of all the contingencies we'd been prepared to meet. None particularly stood out. We finally concluded that Deal must have run into serious trouble in Algeria. This was just about the time the French Foreign Legion revolted, and we were going there. It was all very exciting for weeks and months. I'd been telling my company we had to be prepared, and now it was happening. We were going to war. My biggest concern was how D Company, left to its own devices, had done in this real-life alert just weeks before we'd gotten a new top kick, an E8 issued by DA. He was infantry branch, but had been holed up in some higher HQ for so long he didn't have any idea about what was what. At the TL company level, he was short and fat, and his uniform fit him like a duffel bag. He didn't look anything like a soldier. And though his name was Ball, his extreme fumbling from day one quickly earned him the name of Fingers among the troops I'd fought and screamed to get rid of him. But to no avail, even with Johns backing me all the way, Dar wouldn't budge. My only recourse had been to make Sweeney my unauthorized field first. I had to the rest of my fine NCOs were in shock with this new Jasper in charge, and as much as possible leave Fingers Ball in the office with the company clerk. He was the first computer-issued ticket-punching top I'd ever had to deal with. It was agony just to hold my temper day after day. Logistic problems kept us at one of Operation Windrift's CPS until 200 hours, at which point we and our jeeps boarded Dumbo choppers and headed south. As we passed over the Autobahn, I saw a huge military convoy, close to 500 vehicles, winding its way north up the road. We arrived at Mannheim to be met by a calm and smiling Colonel Johns just as the last trucks were moving out from Coleman Barracks. "Hi, boys, where have you been?" he said, grinning. "Looks as though we're reinforcing Berlin. So I want you to go on home, get yourselves a change of clothes, say goodbye to your wives, and try to catch up with your companies. Hack, you're leading Coker. You're next in the column. So we're going into Berlin," I thought, as I hurriedly packed my gear, hardly, if at all, noticing Patty's anxious eyes. I guessed it had probably been inevitable. The divided city had been a thorn in East-West relations since the moment it was created at the end of World War II, and in recent years, Cush's favourite taunt, it seemed toward the United States, it would be the third major confrontation over Berlin. The first in 1948 arose when three of the four powers that occupied Germany, the US, French and British, decided to unify their zones and rebuild West Germany. Within these borders, Berlin similarly divided deep in the heart of Soviet-occupied Deutz. Land naturally went the same way much as the British and Americans had merged their forces in occupied Trieste. When I was a kid, thus provoked from his point of view, Stalin began to close down all ground access to Berlin until there was none effectively holding the citizens of the free part of the city hostage. The brilliant response on the Allies' part was simply to supply West Berlin by air, and for almost a year that was exactly what they did. Beaten so beautifully at his own game, Stalin finally gave up and reopened the road rail access routes in 1958. The whole show began again with new Premier Kusov threatening another blockade if the West didn't pull its troops out of Berlin to Eisenhower in Paris and to Kennedy in Vienna. Kusov made known his intentions to sign a separate peace treaty with East Germany, giving that host government control over the fate of Berlin in 1959. Eisenhower stated firmly that the US would go to war over the divided city should access to it be denied, died for whatever reason. In both clashes, the US had listed the nuclear response as a proposed solution to the problem. In the first, the Americans were still the sole possessors of atomic weapons, and though this did not stop Stalin from imposing the blockade, it seemed to keep him from any further hostile activities. When the blockade proved ineffective in the second case during Eich's administration, the risk of war over Berlin was once again nuclear, but this time it was for the simple reason that Eisenhower had gutted the armed forces of the ability to wage conventional war. The past months of the new Kennedy administration had been plagued with the problem of Berlin, and after the Bay of Pigs debacle in Cuba, and talks in Vienna with Koch that were no more productive than Eich's last round in Paris. Koch minced no words, "Weck bury you." He'd said the president couldn't afford to screw around. He needed to act decisively on this powder keg issue, and soon both to regain face and get the message to Russia that he meant business. The first step had been taken in July, when Kennedy boosted military manpower ceilings by 100,000, increased the draft call, and raised the defense budget about $3 billion to cover these and other preventive measures, should Koch decide to fight over Berlin. Our reinforcements seemed to be step two, but the question was why Coker picked me up in front of my apartment. We raced out of Mannheim and tore up the Autobahn. Finally, we caught up with the tail end of the steadily moving 1,500-man convoy. It was a formidable bunch. The entire battle group, plus artillery engineers and signal all normal attachments, were present. less tanks moving smartly up the Autobahn and tactical formation 20 m apart.